I'm Kevin Crilly, the Director of Gift Planning, and on behalf of my colleagues from the Office of Gift Planning, Associate Director Randy Silverman, who's in the back, and a new Associate Director, Ed Edwin, and our two gift planning officers, Amanto Marcatuli and Carrie Fuller, we'd like to welcome you to the 21st Benjamin Nye Wheeler Society Lecture and Tea. And for those of you who may have worked with Enid Pollack, I just saw Enid, she's now over in the School of Engineering, no longer in our office, just so you know. Before I introduce Professor Roy, I just wanted to mention, for those of you who might have got here a little late, about our photo booth outside, and ask you to take advantage of that. It's a great opportunity to get a free 5x7 by an incredible artist, Christopher Irion. He's an award-winning San Francisco-based photographer that uses minimal equipment, and you could see the portraits out there. And he's producing hundreds of black and white portraits for UC Berkeley designed to capture the campus's breadth and depth. So he'll be here till about 4:30, even after the tea. So if you're interested in getting your portrait done and filling out a little form, we ask you to do that. And then one other piece of business, the men's room and the ladies' room is downstairs. I'd like to introduce Professor Roy. She's Associate Professor of City and Regional Planning at the College of Environmental Design, as well as Associate Dean of Academic Affairs for International and Area Studies. She's the 2006 recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award and Distinguished Faculty Mentorship Award. And earlier this year, I think it was in April, she received the prestigious Golden Apple Award, which is the only teaching award at Berkeley that comes directly from the students. And she's this year's winner. She is also, as if she doesn't have enough to do, the curriculum director for the Blum Center for Developing Economies, leading the effort to establish a new undergraduate minor in global poverty and practice. And the first time that they offered a class in this that she taught, there were over 600 students who showed up. She holds a BA from Mills College, a master's and PhD from UC Berkeley. She's the author of City Requiem, Calcutta, Gender and the Politics of Poverty, and co-editor of Urban Informality, Transnational Perspectives from the Middle East, South Asia, and Latin America. And her current research project is entitled Poverty Experts, Truth and Capital in the New Global Order of Development. And she's received several prestigious awards for that project, including a research grant from the National Science Foundation. So without further ado, Professor Roy.
As you can tell, we're having just a bit of technical trouble, but I think we will be fine. Good afternoon. It's a great honor to be here today on the occasion of the Wheeler Tea. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share with you some of my research, which is concerned with global poverty and with the study and analysis of different interventions that seek to alleviate poverty. Funded by the National Science Foundation, this research will soon be published as a book titled Poverty Capital, Microfinance and the Frontiers of Millennial Development. But today, I want to place this research in a larger context that involves our lives as global citizens. And in particular, I want to share with you the ways in which UC Berkeley students are actively involved in the struggle against global poverty. Having been at Cal for many years now, first as a graduate student and now as a faculty member, at what is, I believe, the world's greatest public university, I strongly believe that research, teaching, and action are all linked. Cal faculty bring cutting-edge research into the classroom, but we are all constantly educated by our students, by their passion, by their issues. And as faculty and students, we are united in our quest for the ways in which knowledge can matter, can make change. This, for me, is the magic of Cal. For me, this magic is also evident in a new undergraduate curriculum that I have the privilege to lead, the minor in global poverty and practice, which is housed in the International and Area Studies teaching program. The minor is the initiative of the Blum Center for Developing Economies, which was established in 2006 through a generous gift by Richard Blum. the center is committed to train the next generation of global leaders to be dedicated to the alleviation of poverty. Through the minor in global poverty in practice, undergraduate students are able to work directly with poverty-focused organizations in different parts of the world and to reflect upon how such an experience transforms their role as doctors, lawyers, engineers, artists, architects, philosophers, writers. It is hard to imagine a program that is a better fit with the values of Cal, and not surprisingly, as you've heard, Cal students have in turn responded with considerable enthusiasm for this program. So today I'm going to talk about the broader historical moment at which we find ourselves, a moment at which there is an acute awareness of global poverty and the need to do something about it. Now, this can be a moment of paralysis in the face of overwhelming global forces, but it can also be a moment when a new global social contract is written, when the sense that another world is possible is actualized. Indeed, the start of the millennium has been marked by the remarkable emergence of a global conscience. And there are two issues in particular that command this conscience. One of them is the environment, the other is poverty. And Cal has played a leading role on both of these issues. In fact, Chancellor Birgenau's recent Carnegie Academic Leadership Award notes his role in leading the campus on both of these issues. These are unusual times indeed. In 2000, the member states of the United Nations ratified the Millennium Development Goals, a sweeping set of human development goals that range from improving access to primary education to providing the world's poor with clean water and sanitation. The most ambitious goal was the idea that by 2015, it would be possible to halve extreme poverty in the world. Now, there are iconic figures that loom large in this moment that lead the massive global campaigns to end poverty. The Gates, for example, who have built the world's largest foundation. And then, of course, there is Bono, my favorite global poverty campaigner. For those of you who share a love in U2 music, though my colleagues tell me that my interest in Bono very easily reveals my age, Bono manages to make human what is at stake in this millennial moment, to make it our issue. This was evident 2 years ago when I attended his concert in the Oakland Coliseum, 25,000 people. I'd managed to convince my husband that the concert tickets were my birthday present to him. The things that husbands will do for wives. But Bono, in between his music, which I love, insisting that we could be the first generation to outlaw the kind of extreme, stupid poverty that sees a child die of hunger in a world of plenty. The first generation that can unknot the whole tangle of bad trade, bad debt, and bad luck. The audience, much younger than I am, is of course wearing white wristbands. Bush wasn't in the audience, but he, like everyone else, has signed on to Bono's campaign. They have all promised to make poverty history. But this idea of ending poverty is perhaps not a completely new idea, and yet its new presence is a bit of a surprise, because in fact, a decade ago, the world was abuzz with a different idea, that of the end of history. Francis Fukuyama's triumphant claim of the victory of free market capitalism. Fukuyama argued that the ideal of free market capitalism could not be improved upon, that humankind had reached its ultimate end state, and thus there was no need for the idea of progress or the idea of history. How did we move from that unshakable faith in free markets to a global concern about poverty, from the end of history to the end of poverty? Well, in 1993, a year after Fukuyama's book was published, Jacques Derrida, the legendary French philosopher, wrote against Fukuyama, and he wrote this: "For it must be cried out at a time when some have the audacity to neo-evangelize, that no degree of progress allows one to ignore that never before, in absolute figures, have so many men, women, and children been subjugated, starved, or exterminated on this earth. It is this macroscopic fact, the 1 billion people living in extreme poverty, earning less than $1 a day, that drives the millennial imagination of ending global poverty. It's important to note that at least in this country, 9/11 has deepened this awareness of poverty, of the rage and anger bred from unemployment, economic crisis, and eroded safety nets. And it's perhaps unfortunate that it took 9/11 to recognize that free market capitalism had not, in fact, served many parts of the world. That in the Middle East, in countries like Egypt and Jordan and Morocco, about 40% of the educated youth population today is unemployed. In other words, an entire generation has come of age in the Middle East with little prospect of a life better than their parents. Where then is the promise of the millennium? And so as the US has waged its war on terror, so it has struggled with the war on poverty, particularly in the Middle East. And I say struggled because my research and that of many other faculty on this campus show how in the Middle East, US-led development has been easily outflanked by indigenous organizations, many of them hostile to US interests, be it Hezbollah or Hamas or the Muslim Brotherhood. But that is the occasion of another talk. Let me return to our millennial moment and the ambition to end poverty. How is poverty to be ended? How is it to be mitigated? Well, there is no easy consensus on this matter. Perhaps the most well-known efforts are led by Jeff Sachs, whose work on the Millennium Development Goals has received international recognition. Sachs seeks to revive the ideas of Keynes and seeks to create a global state of development where there is, in fact, investment in infrastructure, education, health in the poorest countries of the world. But there are many who disagree. William Easterly, who is in fact Jeff Sachs's neighbor in New York, Sachs teaches at Columbia, Easterly at NYU, argues that the tragedy of poverty is not simply poverty. It is that the West has spent $2.3 trillion in foreign aid over the last 5 decades and still has not made a dent in poverty. Easterly calls Sachs a planner, with a capital P, someone with a big Western plan, and a plan that is bound to fail. Instead of planners, Easterly asks and searches for those that he calls searchers, those who can in fact craft grassroots responses to poverty. The poor themselves, he argues, are searchers, and he's particularly keen to let poverty alleviation happen through the market. One of Easterly's most famous lines is this: "The rich have markets, the poor have bureaucrats." This theme undergirds the very popular work of C.K. Prahlad and the idea of the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid. Note the subtitle of his book, Eradicating Poverty Through Profits. These market-based approaches to ending poverty have become very popular, and they intersect with our daily lives constantly. So, for example, the RED campaign is one that allows us, and forgive me if I'm being cynical here, to shop our way to the end of poverty. The belief that we can, in fact, continue with our lives, but that in that process, we can still make a difference. And that, in fact, responsible consumerism can make a big difference in the alleviation of poverty. That's one approach. A quite different approach is that embodied in global social movements. The young kids gathering in the streets, beating at the doors of the World Bank and IMF, and insisting on an overhaul of globalization. From Seattle to the World Social Forums, these movements envision an alternative global order. And at the very least, they seek to reform the apparatus of foreign aid and development. One of their key issues is an improvement in the type and volume of aid that flows from developed nations to those that are less developed. And they're particularly focused on increasing US allocations to aid. Now, in national polls, Americans often believe that 25% of our GDP is in fact spent on foreign aid. Any guesses on what the real number is? I had a 0.2. The Millennium Development Goal, Goal 8, mandates that developed nations allocate 0.7% of their GDP to aid. Not 7%, not 1%, 0.7%. The US in recent years has been allocating 0.15% of its GDP, and there's an interesting disjuncture between that fact and our perception as Americans. Bono, trust me, you're going to see a lot of Bono, for a while has been calling for a 1% tithe on the US national budget. And his campaign, which you see here represented in people who call themselves everyday Americans, the One campaign seeks to mobilize political leaders to commit to that 1% tithe on the US national budget. Everyday Americans are everywhere, making sure that all political candidates, in fact, make a pledge to the ending of poverty. And sometimes the candidates look quite uncomfortable when flanked by these everyday Americans. The issue, of course, is not simply more aid. The issue, of course, is also how aid is spent. And the fact that so much of foreign aid ends up not in the developing world, not in development programs on the ground. Quite a bit of it ends up, unfortunately, remaining in the US, paying for foreign consultants, paying for US equipment, etc. These are important issues because it means that it's no longer enough to simply think about saving the third world. It means that we need to fix what is terribly broken here. And I believe that what is terribly broken here are the foreign and development policies that we produce in Washington, D.C. I'm sorry, this has been jumping ahead. Oops. I promise we'll get there. All right, I'm just going to let it stay at this image. And then I'll see if it changes its mind. There we go. It keeps wanting to jump to this image, which is not where I mean to be, but I will tell you about this image in a minute. But going back to this point about fixing what is terribly broken here, let me give you one example. We spent a lot of effort and energy on aid and development interventions in the crucial sector of agriculture. But all of that effort, all of that money, is cancelled out by one American policy, the US Farm Bill, and its massive subsidies to American agro-businesses. Now, there are similar subsidies in Europe and Japan, and together they make it impossible for small farmers in the world's poorest countries to compete with the dumping on world markets of subsidized American or European or Japanese wheat or rice or corn or sugar. These efforts have been charted by many distinguished Cal faculty, from Robert Reich to Pranab Bardhan to Alain Desgendry. And the effects have been devastating for poor countries. This has also been one of the most important breaking points in various World Trade Organization negotiations with developing countries like India and Brazil, repeatedly walking out of those talks saying that it's useless to talk about anything else in foreign aid and development if we cannot fix this issue of agricultural subsidies. That while there is a lot of talk of free markets and free trade, this is as far from free markets as we can get. This issue is a sobering thought for all of us, that perhaps the one most effective thing we can do to mitigate global poverty is to exercise our right as American citizens to hold our elected representatives in Washington, D.C. accountable for poke barrel politics. Now, there is no easy consensus on how to end poverty. My research pays attention to these different approaches to poverty and assesses their shortcomings and strengths. My most recent work, the subject of this new book, is about one of the most popular ideas and practices of poverty alleviation, something that many of you may have heard of, and that in fact this image is about, microfinance, which is the practice of giving very tiny loans, sometimes loans as tiny as $10, to very poor women, mainly women, but at times men, without collateral, at high interest rates, but with a proven record of repayment. These loans allow the poor, who are usually shut out of commercial banks, to start businesses, improve access to housing and services, smooth seasonal drops in food consumption, pay for the education of children, survive a health crisis. Microcredit is a development concept that originated in the Grameen Bank of Bangladesh, founded by Muhammad Yunus in 1976. And since then, it has rapidly globalized. Today, microfinance is everywhere. The United Nations celebrated 2005 as the year of microfinance. In 2006, Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, with the prize committee recognizing this effort, I quote, to create economic and social development from below. But as microcredit has globalized, so it has transformed. This transformation has meant that microfinance is now a frontier market, one that can reach the bottom billion, the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid. Led by the World Bank, this is an ambitious effort that seeks to link some of the poorest people in the world with some of the richest money markets in the world. Today, there are billions of dollars in various financial funds that are seeking to invest in microfinance. Now, you may ask, why would Wall Street bankers seek to do business with those earning less than $1 a day? The answer, as the title of one book puts it, is because the poor always pay back. So you can think of microfinance as one massive subprime market. And as other subprime markets have collapsed, which we have seen here in the US this past year, this idea of high interest lending to the otherwise financially untouchable poor has become quite compelling to Wall Street and other financial markets. So a World Bank director in a recent interview said the following: microfinance has matured into one of the most successful and fastest growing industries in the world. Worldwide, these leading microfinance institutions are nearly twice as profitable as the world's leading commercial banks. In short, microfinance is rapidly becoming an asset class, but with a twist. It also promises to serve the bottom billion, to alleviate poverty, to empower poor women. The promise is very compelling. The promise is that of the democratization of capital. The democratization of capital. And it's even more compelling because the figure of poor third world women is central to this story. Microfinance is primarily focused on lending to poor women, and the argument is that women are not only economically enabled by these loans, but they are also politically empowered by them. There is also another argument that women, in fact, in these households, spend their money in ways that are better than men. that they in fact spend this money on feeding and educating their children, in investing in housing, they save. And it's an argument, therefore, about good women and irresponsible men. But good and empowered women, then, are the linchpin of this process of the democratization of capital. But the questions remain. Is this a revolution in global financial markets? Is this going to be a kinder and gentler rather than bullish Wall Street? Or is this yet another subprime technique that is going to slip into predatory lending? The dilemmas posed by these questions speak to the dilemmas often at stake in poverty alleviation, and they're not unique to microfinance. They exist in every sector. So, for example, a controversy has been brewing about one of the microfinance darlings of Wall Street, an organization called Compartamos, which lends primarily to poor women in Mexico. It charges interest rates of 90% per year, and it serves 1 million poor women a year. Most important, it makes a healthy profit. It made $80 million in profit last year. So here is an organization that started out as a Catholic NGO, is now a full-blown commercial entity that sold 30% of its stock in an initial public offering last year that brought in $458 million on the Mexican stock market. Supporters argue that the high interest rates of 90% a year are necessary because they reflect the real costs of lending to the poor. And by the way, poor women are flocking to Compartamos, so what's the problem? Critics argue that this is predatory lending. This is about making a profit in the poverty industry, and that increasingly microfinance is going to be focused on this financial bottom line. They fear that the poorest will soon be excluded, will soon be redlined, returning us full circle to the very moment at which microfinance was started, i.e. that the poor were excluded from commercial banking. The fierce debate continues, but halfway across the world, a different approach to microcredit is being asserted. And for me, being halfway across the world in Bangladesh has been incredibly inspiring. Bangladesh is one of the poorest countries in the world, but it is also home to some of the world's largest NGOs or non-governmental organizations. Organizations that directly provide services to the poor, organizations that dwarf the Bangladeshi state in the scale and scope of their service delivery. So while we're very familiar with the Grameen Bank, there are others, for example, something called BRAC, which serves 12 million poor men and women and provides everything from primary education to health to microfinance. It's important to note that the top institutions in Bangladesh are independent and financially independent of both the state and foreign donors. It is therefore a quite unique context of development and one from which we have a lot to learn. The Bangladesh approach is particularly focused on poor women, not just on their economic enablement, but on their political enablement. So, for example, BRAC has launched thousands of village organizations run by these women who are now in turn running for political office. There's been a dramatic change in the politics of the Bangladeshi countryside. Or the Grameen Bank, that Nobel Peace Prize winner from 2006, has a very interesting housing loan policy. It makes housing loans to very poor women in rural areas. But there's one catch. The loan has to be given to a woman borrower, and the little piece of property, often it's tiny, at times it's as tiny as this stage, has to be in the name of the borrower, which means that what we're beginning to see in Bangladesh is a flourishing of women who hold rights to property. A silent revolution in a patriarchal context where such property rights would not otherwise have been possible. Indeed, the very imagination of poverty alleviation and development is different in Bangladesh. Muhammad Yunus, in his famous book, Banker to the Poor, has this wonderful critique of what he sees as the ivory tower of the World Bank and other organizations. Let me quote. One day, I was approached by an American journalist who was openly irritated by my apparently endless carping against development aid organizations such as the World Bank. He said in a challenging voice, "Instead of always being so critical, could you tell me what concrete steps you would take if you became president of the World Bank?" I said coolly, "I suppose the first thing I would do would be to move the headquarters to Bangladesh." "Why on earth would you do that?" the journalist asked. And I said, "Well, if the objective of the World Bank is to combat poverty, then it seems to me that the bank should be moved to a location where poverty is at its worst. And if the headquarters were moved to Bangladesh, many of the bank's employees would refuse to come, especially those not interested in alleviating poverty. It would mean that the bank would then only be made up of those committed to this cause, and it would drastically reduce costs, as Bangladeshi salaries are so much lower than those in Washington, D.C. Now, the effects of the Bangladesh experiment are now palpable, with not only improved lives, but in fact changes in the macroeconomy. A recent World Bank report states that Bangladesh has made significant economic and social gains since the 1990s, that its human development achievements have been remarkable in achieving the Millennium Development Goals, and in fact, Bangladesh far outstrips other countries that are at a similar rate of poverty. What we have here is a model quite different then from that of Komparthemos. But this is the excitement of our millennial moment, that there are many different pathways to the end of poverty. I was drawn into the study of all of this because of the lively battle of ideas. And this is what I seek to teach my students, that often there is no single right way. Each has its consequences, its compromises, its betrayals. But the battle of ideas is real, and they can participate. In fact, they must participate. As that famous voice from Chiapas reminded us a few years ago, ideas are also weapons. Ideas are also weapons. And that is very true of the role that we all stand to play at UC Berkeley. The beauty of being at Cal is that our students are indeed on the front lines of the struggle with poverty and inequality. There are students fighting for fair trade, for the reform of global governance, for the dream that another world is possible. Through the Blum Center for Developing Economies, our undergraduates are headed to Bangladesh to learn about the work of Brock and Grameen. They are in Ecuador working with indigenous communities to improve sanitation. They are in the slums of Mumbai testing water purification devices to combat the killing fields of waterborne diseases. They are in Zambia seeking to reduce the vulnerability of poor women and their children to HIV/AIDS. They are in Rwanda making sure that poor farmers have access to simple instruments that will improve their income. In this case, a bicycle that can provide transportation to the nearest market town. They are in Tijuana, Mexico, tackling the pollution that afflicts the environment of the poor. They know that their presence will not be the silver bullet that solves the problem of poverty. They are humble and modest. They are there to partner and learn. And it is precisely because of this approach that change may be possible. In many ways, I cannot wait to get older, to fast forward, to see what these students will be doing 10 to 15 years from now after graduating from Cal, how they are, in fact, and will be changing the world. It's our responsibility to recognize and validate their work. I don't know how many of you followed the recent exchange in the New York Times about Harvard. I'm not sure how many of you care to read about Harvard, but a June 23rd article lamented that many Harvard students head out to the big and irresistible paychecks of Wall Street instead of getting involved with public service. Harvard is wondering how it can inculcate in its students a sense of public service. Now, we don't have that dilemma here at UC Berkeley. And also, a big paycheck and public service are not necessarily mutually exclusive. It is perfectly possible to be on Wall Street and to change the world. But we do face a challenge. How do we as a society reward public service? In response to the June 23rd article, a Harvard alum wrote a very interesting letter to the New York Times, and I wanted to share an excerpt with you. He writes, 2 years after I graduated from Harvard, I became a teacher. Many years, I was unable to make a contribution to Harvard. Never did Harvard send me a letter thanking me for my public service. I received letters of thanks only when I was able to financially contribute. If Harvard truly wanted graduates to take low-paying jobs in order to serve the public good, it will need to account for the fact that these alumni will be making a choice to support society as a whole over supporting Harvard. Perhaps naming a building after one of them would be a good start. Food for thought indeed, but enough about Harvard's troubles. It's a privilege to witness and participate in the work of Cal's students, and as I wind down today's talk, I want to leave you with 2 examples. The first is a story about one of my former undergraduate students, Daniel Zugby, who is now at Oxford University on a Marshall Scholarship, doing a graduate degree in development studies. In his senior year at Cal, Daniel, who majored in urban studies and minored in Middle Eastern studies, was the recipient of several prestigious awards. The Berkeley's Haas Fellows Award, the statewide Strass Fellowship, Berkeley's Bears Breaking Boundaries Award, and the Friesen Prize in Urban Studies. And he had an idea for a project. Daniel had grown up in the Palestinian territories and had watched the healthcare system collapse under conditions of war and curfew. His grandmother died of diabetic complications because of lack of access to healthcare. In his classes at Cal, he had researched this situation rigorously, from the sad fact of preventable deaths in many parts of the world to the complete crisis that was the Palestinian healthcare system. But he wanted to do something about it as well. And so in his senior year, Daniel headed to Bethlehem, setting up 50 microclinics, each a community-owned and managed health center where people share glucose monitoring devices, check for diabetes and blood sugar, and more generally take charge of their own health. Aware of the large numbers of educated but unemployed youth, Daniel also mobilized university students as volunteers, thereby connecting different generations and inspiring youth to be connected to their communities. I believe that this is not just an infrastructure of low-cost, low-barrier health, it is an infrastructure of peace. Today, at the ripe old age of 21, Daniel is the founder and director of an international organization, the Global Microclinic Project, that is running similar microclinics all over the Middle East, and that was recently awarded a large grant by the International Diabetes Foundation. And the ties to Cal only grow stronger. Daniel's project is now housed in the Blum Center, and it now funds a new generation of UC Berkeley undergraduates as they go out and seek to tackle the problem of healthcare in poor communities. The second story comes from work in India, and it is about Cal's role in addressing the challenge of urban poverty. As you all perhaps know, the 21st century will be an urban century. The human condition will be an urban condition in the 21st century, with more people living in cities than in any other form of human settlement. But what sort of a human condition will this be? In India, it is a miserable human condition, a warehousing of humanity in slums and squatter settlements, deprived of the most basic human services. For many years, my research has focused on this urban poverty, the roots of which can be traced to India's countryside. So that even though India has been growing at a brisk rate of 9% per year, its agricultural sector, on which 60% of the country's population relies, is in crisis, leading one commentator to talk about the world's largest democracy as the Republic of Hunger. And Indian urbanization has been cruel, evicting the poor and demolishing their shanty towns in order to make way for shopping malls, gated communities, and upscale spaces of leisure. There are different ways of intervening in this urban crisis, but CAL's role has been quite bold, to focus on the fundamentals, the very ways in which Indian cities are designed, planned, and produced. So in 2006, we were approached by Stanford graduate, and yes, you heard right, Stanford, Sabir Bhatia, who is a Silicon Valley entrepreneur and co-founder of Hotmail. Eager to make a difference in his home country, India, the young Mr. Bhatia had entered into a public-private partnership to build a brand new city in northern India, and he had acquired 11,000 acres to do so. He hoped that this was going to become a model of sustainable urban development in India, that it was going to be everything that other Indian cities are not. But how was this to happen? Well, he came to Berkeley because we have unique expertise in urban planning as well as in the study of the Indian economy. All through 2007, a group of CAL faculty and graduate students, led by my colleague Nizar Al-Sayed, worked on the master plan for Nano City. You're seeing here one of the many meetings between CAL faculty and students and the villagers, and this wonderful circle of conversation. Organized as an architecture and planning studio, students went to India to meet with stakeholders and policymakers, from top cabinet ministers to the poorest farmers. The plans that they drafted were ambitious and yet realistic. They advanced an ecologically intelligent design and anchored the growth of the city with a world-class public transportation system. Most important, the students imagined an inclusive city, taking into account the fact that the poorest workers often do not find a home in Indian cities, that in fact most cities forget to provide for the very construction workers and day laborers who build cities. And so the students started by creating a workers and builders city that would be as important to Nano City as the high-tech city. They used a simple and brilliant motto: it takes a village to build a city. Today, these plans form the basis of the real Nano City, outcompeting the work of professional design and planning firms. And the plans were presented to a large delegation of Indian ministers and planners last year here at CAL. Now, Nano City may not be built in this way. In fact, I can bet that it will not necessarily be built according to plan. No city really is. But the students bravely took on a difficult task, one with many practical and ethical challenges. I believe that that is what we do at CAL. We are the 21st century university because we tackle the most difficult issues of the 21st century. We do so through the production of knowledge and through the translation of that knowledge into forms of practice. Other universities do this too. But what is unique about CAL is that in doing so, we position our students, graduate students, and most important, undergraduate students, as partners, problem solvers, and innovators. We teach them, but they teach us too, through their passion. Their issues become the issues of the university, the issues of the lab, the research center, the classroom. I'm privileged to be a part of this magic. Thank you for being here today.
if anyone has any questions for Professor Roy, we've got a microphone right here. So you probably want to come up here.
Does the 0.15% that goes to foreign aid, does that include private contributions like Save the Children and things like that?
That's a great question. No, it does not. In fact, we don't have good figures on the volume of private contributions. We have better figures on the flow of corporate investment. And I can tell you this, that the flow of corporate investment today dwarfs all flows of what is known as overseas development assistance.
The individual, how can they invest in the Amish bank?
In the Grameen Bank?
Yes.
There are different ways of doing so. You can do so through particular funds that, in fact, invest in microfinance, but you can also do that directly. Grameen has various vehicles. So there's something called Grameen Education that allows one to invest directly and to earn, I think, a 6% return on your investment. And you can decide to be simply an investor and receive that return, or you can decide to be very involved in the actual work of the Grameen Bank. For example, Grameen Education gives scholarships to the children of very poor men and women, and you can decide to be involved in selecting scholarship recipients, keeping in touch with them. But there are many ways of investing in microfinance, and if you email me, I'd be glad to give you more details.
One of our colleagues a few years ago wrote a book, There Is No Aging in India. I'm sure you are familiar with
Yes.
it. But now there is aging. And so anything special, is it planned for the older people?
So,
Or to prevent young people to getting older too soon, which is even more important.
well, India is one of those inspiring and yet heartbreaking examples of 21st century development. A country that is growing at a very brisk rate, where the upper echelons of the middle class have enjoyed great prosperity. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday, I think, talking about how there are now 1 million Indian households making more than $100,000 a year. That is not the India in which I grew up. And I celebrate that prosperity, and yet inequality in India is growing very quickly. And that inequality poses great challenges for how India will take care of its very young and its very old. Challenges not unlike those perhaps that we face here.
How does Jubilee USA fit into this picture?
So I didn't talk specifically about US aid. A lot of my microfinance research has been focused on US aid. So I've been spending a lot of time in Washington, D.C. 2 points to make about US aid. One is that they have been very interested in promoting the more commercialized version of microfinance. But then the US Congress in recent years has passed a series of quite stunning legislative bills curbing that action, arguing that before USAID launches into the sort of compartamos model, it has to think about whether or not it is alleviating poverty. And that it has to demonstrate to the US Congress, one, that USAID money is actually reaching the poor, and two, that that money is having an effect. So the big battle in DC has been around these measurements, and there's been a lot of stalling. The other aspect of USAID that I study is that it's an important actor in the Middle East. It's meant to be the entity that brings together the war on terror and the war on poverty, particularly in a country such as Egypt. And sadly, I do not think it is very effective, despite the large amounts of money that it continues to spend in the Middle East.
Is the best bang for our buck still the Peace Corps and VISTA for our foreign aid, and why don't we hear about it as much?
I think the Peace Corps is a wonderful institution. You may know this, that of all North American universities, Cal sends more men and women to the Peace Corps than any other university. And I think that the work that we've been trying to do through the Blum Center, or other more specific programs. We have a new partnership with the Tata Corporation in India, for example, are programs that are somewhat inspired by the Peace Corps, by Teach for America, except that instead of involving young people in this work after they have graduated, we have been trying to do this much earlier. And our sense is that we should not be in the business of producing hundreds of development specialists. Yes, development specialists are needed, and we do have majors at Berkeley that produce development specialists. But our hope is that these kids will go on to become engineers, doctors, lawyers, writers, artists, architects, but that regardless of what their career and profession will be, this experience of being in other parts of the world, of working on these issues, will make a difference not only in how they lead their personal lives, but in also the type of professional that they will be. But that is, in some ways, the Peace Corps model. Sure.
Hello. Hi. I'm doing high-level research in the field of technology, high-level by Berkeley standards. And I'm interested in giving this technology to poorer countries. And so, do you know about the outlets, right? I'll have to talk to you personally probably, but you probably know the outlets through which we can send the technology over.
Well, I think that one of the quite unique things about the work that is happening at Cal, and a lot of this has to do with the leadership of our faculty, and particularly the leadership of someone like Shankar Shastri, who's the Dean of the College of Engineering, is that we are committed to the idea of technology for a better world. Dean Shastri often talks about how it's not enough to develop a good technological prototype or product and somehow throw it over the wall of the university and hope that it will land and make a difference. That we have to think about how these products and ideas make a difference in the lives of people. So yes, there are many ways in which we can have a conversation about these issues.
Thank you, Professor Roy. We want to give you a little token of our appreciation for all the time that you've spent. She is going to join us at the tea, which is right next door. So if some of you still have questions, feel free to grab her. And also, there's information about both the Blum Center and the Institute for South Asian Studies, a couple of the places that she is affiliated with, in the back. So you can get that also as you make your way to the tea next door or before you leave. Thank you. Thank you. That was great.